and it was your standard Saturday morning. In our house, it was bowls of cereal and cartoons. It was like cartoons until 10 o'clock because that's when Jackie Chan came on and we weren't interested in that. So we watched all the way to 10 o'clock. But I remember there was one infomercial that Saturday morning that I thought was going to change my life forever. And it was this kid, and he had this giant orange sniper rifle. It was a Nerf gun, and it was the new CS6 long shot. And I knew from the moment I saw it that that thing was going to complete my life. That's all I needed in the world to be happy. And there was all the slow motion action shots of the kids like jumping behind sandbags and shooting each other. And I thought, I'm going to be the hero of the neighborhood as soon as I get the CS6 long shot. Well, Christmas was right around the corner. And so I thought, this is all I want. I couldn't think of anything else to put on the Christmas list. And my birthday's in January, so I was like, and I don't even know what I want for my birthday after that. Once I get the CS6 long shot, I will be in need of nothing else for the rest of my life. And I wish I could start the sermon today by being like, I know the secret to happiness. When I was 14 years old, I got a CS6 long shot, and I've never needed or wanted anything ever since. But I remember it didn't take very long for the newness of that to wear off. And eventually I wanted something else. We're going to talk about contentment. I think it's an appropriate time of year to talk about contentment, just because it's about getting stuff in a lot of ways. Christmas is about the giving of gifts, but we have Thanksgiving, which, I don't know how many of you go around the table and say, what you're thankful for when you're eating the Thanksgiving meal. But you have this holiday that's about being thankful for what we have, and then you have the crazy mobs that follow on Black Friday when everyone's just like rushing to the store, grabbing everything that they can, and it's very ironic. We're going to talk about contentment, but I want to talk about it in the way that Paul talks about it, because it's very interesting when he talks about why he can be content and what all of that involves. Lack of contentment is often wrapped up in the future that we don't have and the things that we don't have. There are sometimes when people hear they're struggling with a certain sin problem, or there's something that the preacher is talking about, or someone in Bible class is talking about that they're struggling with, and they may say something along the lines of, and this can lead to spiritual death. And there are those that go, ooh. For a second I thought he was talking about physical death, or this was going to harm me in some way physical, but spiritual death, for some reason, sometimes it's not that urgent, because we think, well, what is spiritual death? How harmful can this really be? But the problem of discontent, or those that don't live life in a content way, are absolutely miserable. They're constantly chasing things and chasing a future that they don't have, chasing things that they don't have, and they think that if they can just get the next thing, or if they can get to this moment in their life, then they'll be content forever. They won't need anything else. And I think this way. I think it's just a human way of thinking. But if I can get here in my job, if my relationship can get here, if I can just retire here, if I can just make it here, then I'll be content. I won't need anything else. But how many people reach those goals and then set new goals? How many people get those things and then the newness wears off and they want something else? They're never fully satisfied. But as you know, Paul is writing this letter from prison. It's not a very happy place to be, especially a Roman prison. But he's been in several prisons along the way, and yet he's still able to say in chapter 4, I've learned in every situation to be content. And then there's that verse that follows in 4:13 that sometimes we abuse and pull out of context. It's when he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it's under that section, maybe if you're a teenager or young, especially if you're a male, you might use that verse and go, I can do this because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Speed limits don't apply to me. Or, fill in the blank on what they want to do. But Paul is talking about something very specific here. He's talking about his own spiritual life. There's nothing in this life that's going to pull him away from the church. There's nothing that's going to completely destroy him or take away his joy and his contentment, because he can do anything in this life with Christ. He's talking about it in a spiritual sense, but contentment is this strange concept in Christianity where it is physical and it's spiritual. Because when you suffer or if you are dealing with discontent, you have no gratitude in life, you're always seeking something this guy, I watched one of George C. Scott. I don't know which one you watched, but that's like a classic that we watched growing up in our house. But he spent his whole entire life trying to make this fortune. And it's a classic Christmas story, but he has this big house, he has everything at the end, but he lives very frugally. He's just a penny pincher. He doesn't want to spend anything. And I remember thinking, even as a young kid watching this movie, I'm like, he's so old. Like, he's not going to live for much longer, and that's a lot of money to spend. He better get on it, if he's going to enjoy any of that wealth that he had. I didn't understand his character, but he was very crotchety. He was very mean. And I'm not saying if you are trying to save money, you're Scrooge. That's not what I'm saying, but he spent his whole life chasing this wealth. He got the wealth, and he's still absolutely miserable. And then you have someone like Paul writing from prison with pretty much nothing. In fact, he relied on the churches that he ministered to support him in his ministry. But if you look through Philippians, some people will say that Philippians is a book of joy, or it's a book about joy. And it really isn't. He's asking two specific ladies. I mean, he calls out two ladies, Yodia and Syntyche, who are having this argument in the church there at Philippi. And he's basically saying, you guys need to get it together because you're causing disunity within the church and you're making a big scene. And he calls them out by name. And I can't help but think every time I read this that in this time they would take the letters and they would read it in front of the entire congregation. And so you have Yodia and Syntyche, they're sitting there and they're having this big argument. And someone gets up in front of the congregation and goes down, starts reading through the letters, and then they're called out in church. I'm a preacher's kid. I know what that's like. It's not very comfortable. I could not do it with anything growing up. I'd be in the pew, I'd be whispering, passing notes or whatever. And my dad, on several occasions, has said, Dale, stop. And when you say that in a microphone, from a pulpit, and you're younger, and you feel like this big, it's like all eyes just look at you, and your face is red, and it's miserable. But Paul did that. He calls out two ladies, and people say, well, this is a book of all about joy, when in fact, Paul is talking to them about making his joy complete. Because he recognizes, if you look in chapter 1 and verse 20, he hints towards his coming death. He knows something's about to happen. He's been a prisoner several times. He's reaching towards the end of his life, and he's having this struggle back and forth. Part of me, he says, wants to stay here so that I can continue serving God and continue working and serving for the Lord. But the other part of me wants to go ahead and go on and see God. And all throughout the book, you see that he has this hope and this optimism and this joy. In fact, it's very strange to me that in chapter 4, he's the one writing from prison. But if you see in chapter 4, verse 8, he says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Paul is giving them a pep talk on how their mindset should be, and he's the one in prison. He's basically saying, okay, if you're in a bad place, if you're really struggling with this, think about these things. But where is he? In prison. There was a prison, the Romans were notoriously cruel. And there was a prison where they would keep the prisoners right outside of this giant cliff of Terrapin Rock. And they would keep you there, and then they would torture you there, and then at the end of that torture session, they would take you out and they would throw you off that cliff. And if I'm Paul, that's what I would be thinking. I'd be sitting there being like, what are you guys arguing about? Can you just solve these on your own? I have enough problems of my own. I've got all these different horrible executions to think about, all of this anxiety that comes along with it. But he doesn't. His mindset is completely different. Whatever situation I'm in, I've learned to be content. Have you ever been hungry before? Like really, really, really? If you've ever fasted, that's miserable. But if you haven't eaten in a long time, or if you have gone through a growth spurt, that's scary. How hungry you can be, how much you can eat. Actually, my first growth spurt, I was told when I was younger by someone that if you have a parasite, like a worm inside you, you know that because you're always hungry, because the worm eats the food that you were supposed to be eating. And that stuck in my head. So I remember I was playing football with the youth group, and it was finally time to eat, so all of us went underneath this awning, and we were eating hot dogs and hamburgers, and I was on my fifth hot dog. And so I came up to my friend Tyler, might go on a mission trip to a third world country. And you go to this country and you see people that are living their lives in total poverty. Or they're living under a government that's just a little bit unruly. And we think, wow, I'm so blessed. Or we'll have a good friend go through this tragedy, this terrible, and we'll think, wow, I'm so blessed. I mean, my life might be bad, but it's not that bad. Or we'll visit someone in a hospital, and they'll talk about their health issues and the things that they're going through, and we'll go, man, my life may have some things that aren't great, but it's not that bad. And the list goes on. We can flip over the bulletin that you have and see the prayer list, and all of these people that are going through all these terrible things. You go, I might have some problems, but they're not that bad. But there's just moments where we feel a little bit more content than others, but it's not this life-changing moment. I've been on several mission trips, nothing like Lineball family over here, but I've been on a few short-term mission trips where I come back and I think, we are so blessed to live in America. Like this country is so great. And then a couple of weeks later, I forget. And that's the way we are as humans. But Paul is talking about a lifestyle. No matter what situation he's in, he's learned to be content. That tells us a few things we're going to talk about in just a little bit. So in Philippians 4:11, it says, I've learned in all situations to be content. The word there for content is autarkes and Greek. Now, I bring that up just because it wasn't a very Christian word to use. In fact, this was a philosophy of the Stoics, basically. The Stoics are those that went through this Greek philosophy school, and they believed that everything that happened, whether it was good or whether it was bad, all happened because it was God's will. And so just kick back and relax. It's going to happen anyway. Whatever God wants to happen is going to happen. And they kind of lived life that way. It wasn't a very Christian concept. And yet, Paul uses this word, which means to be self-sufficient, self-reliant. And so Paul basically tells the Christian from prison, I don't need anything because I have something else, something outside of human help. And so he uses this word of self-sufficiency. He's actually talking about Christ, which he'll bring up after that. But obviously, Paul doesn't mean that he doesn't need anything. He's a self-made man. He can get out of prison if he wants to. He doesn't mean that, but what he does mean is that he has something that can't be taken from him. He has something that's not going to change. He can think about whatever former emperor was on the throne at the time in Rome, and there were some very terrible ones. There were a few illustrations of the things that some of these emperors did to Christians that I didn't even want to put in the lesson. It's graphic, it's nasty. But whatever horrible emperor you could think of that would be on the throne at the time, Paul knew who was on the throne in heaven at all times. No one was going to take the Father off the throne. No one was going to pull Christ away from the right hand of the throne. And that's why he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Because Christ, he did die, but he's alive again. And he has empowered Paul to do the things that he's doing, to have the attitude that he has. Being content is living in the moment, to learn to live in the moment, and also to appreciate what we have at all times, no matter what the situation is. It's not circumstantial joy. It's not like you get the CSS long shot or whatever gift it is for Christmas. In that moment, you are so content and you're so happy, and then the moment flees. Paul is saying, no matter what moment I'm in, no matter what's going on in my life, I have learned to be content. There are no circumstances that are going to change that. I want to look at 3 truths about contentment here from this verse. Looking at verse 11, it says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger and abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. See, what he's saying is, I know how to be brought low in verse 12. I know how to abound. His state does not change on the circumstances. He's going to be content no matter what. If he's up here, he's content. If he's down here, he's content because of what he has in Christ. But I want us to notice 3 things about contentment from this verse. Anyone can be content anytime about anything. It doesn't matter. It's very easy for us to become self-absorbed and talk about all of the problems that we have. I've done it. I've talked to Janelle sometimes about what a rough time I've been having, or what is not right in my life. And she'll let me ramble for a long time before telling me about something that happened to her at work. And it won't be complaining, and I'll think, ugh, that's way worse than my day. There's way more to complain about, but she doesn't. Paul is saying that, well, it doesn't matter. You can't one-up Paul. If you remember that list that Paul gives, I believe it's in one of the Corinthian letters, when he talks about how many times he's been beaten, how many times he's been stoned, he's been shipwrecked, he's been thirsty, he's been starving to death, he's been thrown in prison, and you can see that in Acts 23, 26, 28. He's in and out of prison all the time. And he's beaten and he's tortured, and yet he still has this kind of attitude. And sometimes we just go, okay, but you don't understand what I'm going through. You don't understand the issues that I have. And if you did understand those things, then you wouldn't be content either. What Paul shows us here is that anyone can be content anytime about anything. But number two, it's a recognized and willful dependence on God. That's what contentment is. It's a recognized and willful dependence on God. If you notice that every time Paul talks about something great about himself, he always points it back to God. The only reason that he can boast, the only reason that he's accomplished anything, the only reason that he is anything at all is because Christ has allowed him to do that. I think sometimes we want the credit for some things. I know I do. And it's very hard sometimes to say, okay, well, I'm actually nothing without God. And not in like this self-defeating way, but we forget what God has given to us, what Christ has given to us. The family that we have, the hope that we have, all the power that we have. That if we can do anything good in this life, it's because of Christ. And so Paul recognizes that, and he's trying to tell these people, and he is executed a couple of years later. But it's a dependence on God. And number three, it's something that can be learned and something that must be learned. I think it's very interesting that he says, "For I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content." And that gives me hope, because it's not like there was something really special about Paul where he just has a great attitude. He's just an optimist. I don't know if you have someone in your life like that, but if you do, you're very blessed to have someone who's just an optimist no matter what. They seem to brighten up the room. But Paul said, I've learned. I've had to go through some things. It's been a journey to get there. And sometimes that's going to be how it is with us. We're going to go through those low points. We're going to have those high points. And if we are only going to be happy based on the circumstances that we're in, we're going to have a very miserable life. Because there's going to be no fulfillment. It's not going to be lasting. But Paul gives us this hope and saying, if you are a Christian, you have something to be hopeful about. You have something to live for, no matter what your circumstances look like. You know, prison carried with it this social stigma. And it does today too. But Paul is writing to them from behind bars. He's preaching to them from behind bars. And that's very discouraging. It was discouraging for some. You have like the relationship between Paul and Timothy. Paul is in prison, and Timothy's having a hard time realizing the guy that he looked up to, who was supposed to teach him everything, is now in prison. And it was a big hit to his morale. But you have the church at Philippi. It kind of gives you the warm and fuzzy feeling, because it's the first church that Paul established there in Europe. And they're with him, and they back him. He's preaching from behind bars, and they're supporting him, and they're listening to him. But I know that some of them did have their issues, like Yodia and Syntyche. And I wonder if this letter was, and there's not really a follow-up, but I wonder if this letter was a wake-up call to, man, there's some bigger things in life that I need to be worrying about, instead of bickering with my sister about whatever they're bickering about. And I don't think we have what they were fighting about, just because we can now apply that to whatever we're arguing about in the church today. But I think this was the kind of letter that was able to wake them up and say, okay, maybe I should stop arguing or worrying about these small things and look at this bigger picture. Because Paul is talking about some very big things, some very serious things about eternity, about where we go when we die. And he says that he's content, even though he admits in 120 that death is on its way.
And he has this joyful expression throughout his writings. And his joy all comes from Christ. His power all comes from Christ. There were people that he did write to, though, in 1 Corinthians, for instance, who had some very big problems and who probably never turned around. But Paul tries to tell us, even though he sounds like that, he almost sounds like a mean father figure in 1 Corinthians. You have to read it out of love. But what he's trying to say is the life of a Christian is the only life there is to live. It's the only life that's going to be fulfilling. Instead of chasing a future that you don't have or chasing something that you don't have, why not be content with Christ? Because that's more than we deserve and more than enough. That home in heaven is not going to be a place that we're going to get there and go, I worked my entire life for this. I stayed faithful and tried to fight through sin struggles that I had for this. No one is going to have that. I went to a beach in Gulf Shores, and it was after a storm or something, and I remember the beach looked so pretty from a distance. We were riding up on, and I grew up in Colorado, landlocked state, no beaches anywhere. And I remember as we got closer, though, the water was disgusting. But from way back on the highway, it was like, wow, beautiful beach scenery. And you get up there, and there was a dead shark in the water. I'm not kidding. The dead shark floating in the water, and I got up to it, and I was like, this was kind of a ripoff. Everyone's talking about how great the beach is, and it smelled really bad, and it was really dirty and murky. I tried to wade out there in the water, and there were all these weeds that were just floating there, tangling up my legs, and it was itchy and sandy everywhere. I remember getting back in the car. I may sound like a wimp for saying this, but I got back in the car, and I was like, I hate the beach. It's a terrible place to be. I mean, there's sand everywhere, and I remember my phone, this is going to sound like a first world problem, I got sand all on the speaker of my phone, so when I tried to play a song, it was like really staticky. And I think this was the worst. Everyone talks about how great the beach is, and they make calendars that have all of these beach sceneries on there, and then I go, and it's the worst thing ever. Heaven's not going to be that way for anybody. You might hate the beach, you might love the beach, but heaven is going to be worth it all. Heaven is going to be worth everything that we have to go through in this life. And through all of Paul's teachings, even those difficult ones when we think, but that's a difficult command. It's hard to have that endurance. It's hard to stay faithful. What Paul is trying to say, and you have to read that message through it all, is stay faithful. Hang on, because heaven is going to be worth it in the end. If you're struggling with something this morning, I know that everyone has their own spiritual battles that they're going through. Why not change that? Why not get right with God? Because the only thing that matters is eternity. The only thing that matters is what's coming. And it may come when you die, and it may come when Christ comes back, but it's coming. Heaven's going to be worth it all. Don't let something pull you away from it. If there's something that you're struggling with that we can help you with by praying for you, or maybe you need help in another way, why not come and let us know? You've been putting off Christ in baptism. You've been putting off that relationship. Today is the day to do it. You've been thinking about it. You know you need to do it, but you haven't done it yet. Do it today. Get it right. Eternity's right around the corner. Why don't you come right now as we stand and as we sing?
Who will follow Jesus standing for the right, holding up his banner